Just because we share a trade agreement with the United States doesn't mean we'll always agree with their approach. The current administration has moved forward with an aggressive package of tax cuts for large corporations. That's their right as a sovereign nation. Some on the right have lobbied us to match those measures. If we were to do that, it would add tens of billions of dollars in new debt, Mr. Speaker.
Welcome back to this special edition of Power and Politics. We're live in the House of Commons foyer. Across the country, the competitiveness alarm had been sounding ever since U.S. President Trump slashed corporate taxes and imposed tariffs on Canada's steel and aluminum. Today, the government responded with targeted measures rather than an across-the-board tax cut. First, all businesses can fully write off all new manufacturing equipment. Second, all businesses can fully write off specified clean energy equipment. And finally, businesses can write off a larger portion of other investments like cars and computers. According to the government, that effectively will reduce the corporate tax rate in Canada from 17% to 13.8%, but the relief will be temporary. All of these measures will be phased out beginning in 2024. Is that enough then to close the competitiveness gap? And just how big is that gap? Lindsay Tedds is Associate Professor and Scientific Director of Fiscal and Economic Policy at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Goldie Hader is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Business Council of Canada. They're both in Calgary. Peter Armstrong is the National Business Correspondent, for CBC News, and he joins us from Toronto. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. Goldie, I'm going to start with you. Your organization had been pushing for some kind of signal in this update that the government would respond to the Trump administration's tax cuts. Did you get the signal that you wanted today?
Well, to be honest, we're pleasantly surprised. It's more than a signal, it's actual action. And I think it's important because what it suggests is the government recognizes that the fiduciary duty of a government, aside from national security, is to protect our economic sovereignty. And when you see your competitors, and the United States is not just a neighbor, it's a competitor of ours, take actions, taking no action would have led to some serious consequences as businesses move their capital investments to another market. So I think the government got the message. I congratulate them on that piece of it. It doesn't let them off the hook on a number of other measures and things that we still need to do. But I think on that issue, and also on regulations, they were able to put forth some specifics on what they're intending to do. Of course, there too, we want to actually see it implemented. But overall, I'd say we're pleased with what we saw today.
Lindsay, what do you think of the measures aimed at corporate Canada in this update?
Well, I would just echo what Goldie said here. The fact that they went with the expensing model, I don't think should come as any surprise. They had clearly signaled that they weren't going to go with the corporate tax rates cuts, and I think that's smart. At least with the capital expensing, you're targeting investment, and you're targeting new investment, not old investment, new investment. And the fact that they sunset, well, I mean that's the case in the United States. So I think we're playing ball well with the United States right now.
Peter, can I ask you for a bit of a reality check? We had the power panel on, and of course the discussion is very political. And the argument being made by some parties, specifically the NDP, is that there's no guarantee that these kinds of write-offs or the purchase of this kind of equipment or machinery will lead to any kind of job creation. Can you talk a bit about what this kind of accelerated system will do for businesses?
Well, it's one of those things where, you can argue both sides in your mind, which I think is the actual definition of insanity. But because they have a point. We don't know what corporations and businesses will do specifically with these tax cuts. We've seen how it's played out in the United States, where there's a $1.5 trillion tax cut introduced, and a lot of that money ended up being used for stock buybacks and stuff. That wasn't necessarily what was intended. What's interesting about this is it's really specifically targeted, and Lindsay just walked you through the specifics of it, and they're going after exactly what they think the economy needs right now, right? Like if we're shifting away from years now of consumer spending and real estate driving economic growth in Canada to a period where the Bank of Canada, at least, is expecting more growth to come from business investment and exports, well, then this is the kind of stuff you want to see. You want to close that competitiveness gap. We're certainly not going to match the broad corporate, tax rate, but you want to see very specific measures that'll encourage some of those Canadian businesses to get money off the sidelines, invest in that new warehouse, that new factory, that new product or piece of equipment that's going to help them get more productive, that will help them sort of grow and increase their efficiency. And that's, at least in theory, what this tax cut, these tax breaks are intended to do.
Goldie, there's also a line of critique out there that the sort of gap, the competitiveness gap has been overblown, that in fact the measures have not had the exact the effect that was promised by Donald Trump in the U.S., and therefore we shouldn't be as worried as we are here. What's your response to that?
Well, the evidence clearly suggests the contrary. The United States economy is on fire. The minister is right. We don't need to replicate what they're doing, and believe me when I say we're not interested in seeing increasing debt or even deficits for that matter. And that's one of the areas that we would go back to, is creating some fiscal discipline in some of the other spending in terms of priorities, where it's going. We need to look at that as well. But to just pick up on Peter's point, I think what we need to recognize is Canadian businesses want to compete and want to succeed in Canada and outside of Canada. This measure, in terms of being able to invest now, will allow for innovation to occur. It will lead to job creation. And big business is not the sole winner here. I know the headlines will say, oh, big business gets a big tax cut. That's maybe the headline, but the subheadline is big business supports small, medium enterprises. There's an entire ecosystem that's connected to the business community. Rising tide will lift all boats, and I will say that this government is hedging its bets that the consumer spending is probably in decline now. The United States economy is not sustainable at the growth rate that they're seeing, so we need to make sure we're ready before that day comes, because it's usually too late to respond at that time. So again, I think they're being prudent and providing some foresight here.
Lindsay, Goldie touched on the idea of fiscal discipline and the size and the number of deficits this government is projecting. If the government is running those kinds of deficits, and specifically in this case around these measures directed at businesses, what does it prevent them from doing?
Well, I think, one, it's important to acknowledge when we're moving on the capital cost allowance system as we have, what we're doing is we're just shifting when that burden is going to hit the tax system. So while an overall corporate tax cut would be a significant ongoing sort of hit, this is really just moving it around. So we see it hitting the books earlier on, and then it eases off as we move forward. But I think what the big problem here is that we are in a period of pretty good growth, low unemployment, and this government, I'm sorry to say, has a spending problem. Any money that it makes in terms of economic growth just goes right back out the door in spending measures, including a non-refundable tax credit for digital subscriptions. This is not necessary at this time, and I would echo, in fact, what the Conservative Party is saying, that there needs to be restraint, and now is the time to do it.
Peter, what do you think of that argument? Does the government have a spending problem?
Well, it's interesting because, yes, we are in a period of economic growth right now, and unemployment is low, and the Bank of Canada says we're operating near capacity. But, I mean, there's an OECD report out today that says growth has peaked, not just in Canada, but around the world. And we're going to start to see a general slowing of growth. And I think the combination of government spending like we're seeing and running of deficits like we're seeing at a time when we're going to start to see GDP growth start to slow down a little bit is where you can get those kinds of problems can start to compound pretty quickly when you have those two things happening at the same time.
Goldie, you and Lindsay are both in Calgary. I know there were a lot of eyes on this update there. Do you think that what was in here is enough for the concerns that are being expressed in Alberta right now?
Well, I can just echo what I've heard while I've been here. I'm an Albertan, and so I can tell you that there was a disappointment of the lack of a strategy to help the Western economy. I mean, I think that the government's had 3 years, and I know it wants to point out that the other government didn't get it done either. But there's an expectation that now more than ever there's a need for actual action on getting our resources to Tidewater. And I believe the Prime Minister is here tomorrow, so it'll be very interesting to see whether he has an announceable, because it can't be just the statement today. The statement today speaks nationally, and I'm optimistic about what it has in a long term. But in the immediate state that Alberta's in, given the crisis literally that it finds itself in, I think they're hoping for more specific actions, and those were not a part of the statement today. Maybe they will be something the Prime Minister touches on tomorrow.
Lindsay, will the allowing of them to like companies in the oil patch to write off equipment and machinery help them? Like, will it help enough to address some of the acute issues that they're facing right now?
It's not going to be enough to help out the real problems and the frustration that that exists in this province. And I'm not entirely sure people around Canada really understand the degree of frustration that people in this province have. I know people were looking for some investments to come back targeted specifically at Alberta to deal with here in Calgary. We have a 30% vacancy rate in businesses in the downtown core, and this is decimating the city's budget. In terms of the discount on the price of bitumen, this is a real problem, and it does take some leadership. And I think that there is some hope that perhaps tomorrow there'll be some unveiling of something very specific to, while it's Alberta specific, this affects the entire economy of Canada.
You know, what they said today that may have a linkage is deregulation, Bessie. I mean, what I hear most from the business community writ large is it's not so much about taxes as much as it is about, frankly, the suffocating feeling that businesses feel, large and small, in terms of the regulatory burdens that are being imposed upon businesses. And regulatory burdens are the low-hanging fruit for government. It doesn't cost them much to remove. In fact, it probably saves them money in the long run and allows businesses to do what they do best and find a way to, to stimulate the economy. That's the right way of doing it, and hopefully some deregulation is on the horizon. They talked very optimistically about it in the economic statement. Getting it done will go a long ways, including particularly in terms of how to move resources to market.
Okay, I'm out of time, so I have to go. But thank you very much to all three of you for your time. Thanks to Goldie Hyder, Lindsay Teds, and Peter Armstrong. We'll be watching that announcement in Calgary tomorrow.